There will never be another raid like Last Wish.
For generations, the Dreaming City housed one of the Awoken's most closely guarded secrets. She is known as Riven. Riven of 1,000 Voices, the last known Ahamkara. She has been taken, and her death is your calling.
In 2018, Destiny 2 was in trouble. Following the release of the game and the first expansion, Curse of Osiris, in the prior year, the player count was declining rapidly. Destiny 2 had launched with controversial changes to major gameplay systems like the double primary ammo system, static weapon rolls, and a much slower pace than its predecessor. This led many players to abandon the sequel as it didn't scratch the same itch as Destiny 1. If Bungie didn't turn the player numbers around, the servers would have to be shut down and Destiny 2 would ultimately become a failure. They needed a home run to regain player trust and revitalize the player base. Warmind stabled the player numbers in the spring, but it would take until the next annual expansion, Forsaken, to win back the support of the Destiny community. Special ammo and random rolls returned, the expansion launched with 2 new destinations, the campaign forever changed the status quo by giving Cade 6 a final death, the Last Wish raid was one of the best received in the franchise's history, and the Shattered Throne introduced the concept of dungeons. Forsaken was a much needed shot of adrenaline that revitalized Destiny 2. Today I want to discuss the pinnacle piece of endgame content in the expansion, the Last Wish raid, and explain why there will never be another raid like Last Wish. Prior to Shadowkeep, Bungie hadn't settled on a format for raids. Annual expansions always shipped with a raid which had an epic scope, spanning 5 or 6 encounters, multiple jumping puzzles, and sometimes an introduction or transitional mini-encounter. Vault of Glass, King's Fall, Wrath of the Machine, Leviathan, and Last Wish all follow this format. Expansions falling outside annual releases tended to be smaller and thus had smaller raids if they had one at all. They usually had 3 main encounters with smaller transitional mini-encounters or jumping puzzles between. Crota's End, Eater of Worlds, Spire of Stars, Scourge of the Past, and Crown of Sorrow followed this format. With Shadowkeep and Beyond Light, Bungie finally found a formula for raids that they stuck to. Each raid would have 4 main encounters with 2 boss fights, at least 2 major jumping puzzles, and sometimes an opening or transitional mini-encounter. In Beyond Light, the raid team added reprised raids halfway between annual expansions to keep delivering raid content at a consistent pace. Bungie finally had found a cadence and formula for endgame content that worked for them, but I argue raids have become too formulaic as a result. These days, when you load into a new raid, there's always going to be 4 encounters and 2 boss fights. It's incredibly consistent at the expense of scope. I miss the epic scale of the first 4 annual raids, especially King's Fall and Last Wish, which broke formula and had 4 boss fights each rather than the standard 2 of all other annual expansions. There's something incredible about the sense of scope that needing to kill 3 bosses before even reaching the final boss creates. The first 3 boss fights of King's Fall made it truly feel like we had to kill Oryx's entire court before we could face him. Similarly, the first 3 bosses of Last Wish establish Riven's domination of the Dreaming City. The first 2 bosses are Techians that have been taken by Riven and Savathûn, forcing them to fight against their will. The third boss is a powerful Taken abomination provided by Savathûn to protect Riven. Both final bosses felt more powerful as a result of their extended entourage of powerful bosses protecting them. Now that Bungie has found their formula of 4 encounters and 2 boss fights, I'm skeptical they'll abandon it anytime in the future, never giving us a raid with the same scope of Last Wish. I hope I'm wrong because it would be fitting to have a similar scope of 5 to 6 encounters with 4 total bosses for the Witness raid in the final shape, as the Witness is the most powerful antagonist the Guardian will have ever faced, but I'm not confident that Bungie will deliver upon that premise. They seem comfortable with their raid formula. Don't get me wrong, the 4 encounter standard has produced some incredible raids that I love dearly, but it makes me sad to think that I'll never be surprised by an extra encounter like the end of Last Wish where there's a 6th encounter that only occurs after you defeat Riven. At this point, I'm convinced there will never be another raid like Last Wish. Last Wish has one of the best stories in the entire Destiny franchise. revitalize. Prior to the Great Ahamkara hunt, Queen of the Awoken Mara Sov makes a deal with an Ahamkara named Riven. Riven helps Mara build the Dreaming City through her wish magic, and gives the Awoken the tools to help Guardians hunt all other Ahamkara to extinction. This makes Riven even more powerful because she's the last of her species, and thus the last living creature with wish magic. Mara constructs a wish wall to communicate her desires to Riven via symbols, so that Riven can't twist the wishes to Mara's detriment. During the Taken War, Oryx assaults the Awoken in the Dreaming City and takes Riven. Riven uses her wish magic to retain free will after being taken. Mara dies during the war and uses hive magic to create a throne world of her own in the Ascended Plane, where she remains trapped until the events of Forsaken. After Oryx's death, Savathun inherits the Taken throne and makes a deal with Riven to get revenge upon the Awoken for keeping her trapped within the city. In the campaign of Forsaken, Riven manipulates Uldren Sov into creating the Scorn, killing Cade, and fighting the Awoken using his desire to resurrect his dead sister. Uldren plays into Savathun and Riven's hands, allowing them to corrupt the Dreaming City. Petra contacts the Vanguard, who sends a fire team of Guardians to kill Riven, hoping to stop the Taken infestation at the source. The fire team enters the Dreaming City and kills Riven, but Savathun uses their intense desire for Riven's death to make one last wish to the Ahamkara, cursing the Dreaming City with an endless cycle of Taken infestation, doomed to forever regrow after being fought back by the Awoken and Guardians. The Shattered Throne dungeon takes place in Mara's throne world, which has also been infested with Taken as part of Savathun's curse. The Guardian kills the wizard Dol Inkaru, putting an end to the infestation. However, because of Savathun's last wish, the infestation returns, growing again until Guardians kill Dol Inkaru again. This curse renders the Dreaming City and Mara's throne world strategically useless to the Awoken because they constantly need to be defended as the cycle repeats. I love how the story of the campaign, raid, and dungeon are all interlinked, giving the entire expansion a sense of narrative focus and unity. The curse cycle is a very cool idea and was the first of its kind for Destiny, one which would return in lesser forms in subsequent expansions. I also love the name of the raid. Last Wish clearly refers to Savathun's wish, which she has manipulated you into carrying out in the raid, killing Riven and dooming the Dreaming City. Since Last Wish, the only raid that has experienced the same level of narrative synergy with the story of the expansion is Deepstone Crypt. DSC fits extremely well and is interlinked with the lore of Europa, Clovis Bray, and Stasis, but most of this is background material from history. The actual events of the raid itself do tie into the story of House Salvation and Aramis, but the enemies of the Deepstone Crypt feel tacked on to the story and don't quite have the pull that Savathun and Riven have. Taniks Reborn is a fun callback, but doesn't capture the gravitas needed to make the raid feel like the climax of a larger story. The only raid that I think has a chance to unseat Last Wish's narrative as my favorite is the Final Shape raid, which has been confirmed to take place prior to the final mission of the campaign and directly involve confronting the Witness. Placing the raid between the two final campaign missions is an interesting idea, but I'm gonna withhold judgment until the actual expansion arrives, whenever that actually happens. I hope, just maybe, that there will be another raid like Last Wish. The soundtrack of Last Wish contains my favorite song in the entire Destiny franchise. No piece of Destiny music is able to get me as hyped as Shell of What Was by Chris Dirksen, Sky Lewin, and Michael Salvatore, which plays twice during Last Wish, once during the Shuro Chi encounter and a second time during the Queenswalk encounter. As with most Destiny music, the game uses multiple versions of the song that are slightly different from the soundtrack version, allowing them to be dynamically used during gameplay. The song blends a traditional string orchestra with a more industrial and processed sound with electric guitars and electric cellos. It has an unmatched intensity that grows over the course of the song, making anything you do while the song plays feel intense. The fast tempo gives Shuro Chi and Queenswalk a sense of urgency that makes the encounters feel incredible. This gels perfectly with both encounters mechanically being a race against the clock. The repeated 8-note leitmotif played by the violins nearly constantly throughout the song feels like a clock ticking, marking the seconds remaining before a wipe. All 7 songs used in the soundtrack of Last Wish are phenomenal, but the other standout is Keep of Voices by Brendan Williams, Michael Salvatore, and Sky Lewin, the theme of the final boss, Riven of 1,000 Voices. It's again a slightly different version than appears on the final soundtrack, as the released version is a traditional full orchestra and choir, while the raid version features a more industrial sound similar to Shell of What Was, making heavy use of synthesizers. Both songs are easily some of my favorites, as Salvatore, Lewin, and the Bungie music department never disappoint. Other raids have featured bangers on par with Last Wish, so it would be lying to say that the raid is unique with regards to the music. Last Wish released before the advent of the modern power leveling and delta systems, meaning the only way to prepare for the raid was to grind to max level, which was difficult in Forsaken. Only a small number of time-gated activities can increase your power level past the soft cap of 520, which is different from the modern system where you can grind to max power by a variety of means, including completing ritual activities. It was impossible to reach the recommended power of 550 for Last Wish in the 10 days before the raid, meaning that players were incredibly underleveled. Even if you met the 550 power, which nobody in the world was able to, the raid gradually increased the power level for each encounter, meaning that Riven was actually 580 power. In Destiny 2, the delta between a player's power relative to the enemies they face determines how much incoming and outgoing damage will be dealt in combat. Currently, the contest mode modifier for Day 1 raids, introduced for Crown of Sorrow after Last Wish, caps the effective power of the player at 20 levels beneath enemies, which stays consistent throughout the raid. This is equivalent to master level content, whereas Grandmaster content is -25 power. Going into the raid, the highest leveled players were at roughly 530 to 540 power, which was only achieved by grinding powerful and pinnacle drops non-stop from the launch of the expansion. This means that most players who tried Last Wish on Day 1 would have been upwards of 50 levels beneath Riven, which is an insane difficulty rarely seen in modern Destiny outside of deliberate challenge runs. That's double the delta of a GM Nightfall. The absurd power delta combined with the mechanical complexity of Last Wish, especially Riven, created a situation where only 2 teams of 6 completed the raid in the first 24 hours and received the Day 1 emblem. Dado's team finished 2 minutes late, meaning they missed out on Day 1 by a razor-thin margin. A couple of minutes was the distance between their team and one of the rarest emblems in the game. Some people don't like contest mode as a concept because it makes raids more accessible, but I think it's important to allow people with full-time jobs to participate in the raid race without needing to grind non-stop to reach the appropriate level for the race. It is incredibly special to make the Day 1 emblem that rare, but I think it's better for the community and overall health of Destiny to have a higher but still relatively small proportion of the player base able to clear contest raids. I quite like where things stood for the Crota reprised raid race. It was pretty easy to get to the power level that you needed for the raid. However, the actual raid itself was the challenging barrier to completion rather than an arbitrary power delta. The Last Wish raid race is a relic of a bygone era before the modern leveling changes. There will never be another raid like Last Wish. The entrance to the raid features a secret mechanic. Players can climb up to the top of the cave before Kalli and reach the wall Queen Mara used to communicate wishes to Riven via symbols. There are 14 combinations of symbols that can be input into the grid to make various changes to the raid, reminiscent of classic video game cheat codes. There are wishes to be teleported to each encounter of the raid after Kalli, giving players free checkpoints of each encounter without using an external service like D2 Checkpoint. There are wishes to change Riven's voice lines to different characters, reflecting her ability to shapeshift and impersonate other people. There are also wishes to spawn various secrets within the raid, like the corrupted eggs, glittering key chest, and an extra key to loot the chests at the end of the raid. There's even a wish activating a secret mode called Petra's Run that sends players back to orbit if anyone dies, effectively enforcing a flawless run of the raid. Petra's Run is amazing, and I wish it could be be implemented into other raids, allowing you to make the game wipe you automatically if you mess up a triumph you select, rather than having to manually wipe when doing triumph runs. I fucking love the wish wall and think it's the single coolest feature Bungie has ever put into a raid. We've never seen anything like it since, which is a damn shame. There will never be another raid like Last Wish. The first encounter of the raid is a boss fight against the corrupted Techian Kalli. The fight is incredibly simple, involving stepping on plates matching the symbols around the center of the arena, and dodging back and forth, avoiding the taken blights that spawn on 2/3 of the plate at any given time. Afterwards, a knight spawns that must be killed. Getting to damage is so easy that it can be done without any communication in no mic runs. Everyone picks a plate and makes sure they're the only one on it, and because there's 6 plates that need to be activated, it sorts itself out naturally. There's also a cheese to subvert the mechanics, but I dislike it because the encounter is so easy that it's more convenient just to do Kalli legit. The DPS phase is interesting because Kalli has a wipe mechanic that can be dodged by going inside small chambers beneath the stage she stands upon. The doors will close after a few seconds and anyone remaining outside will die. This repeats 2 more times until damage is over. The doors mechanic is an interesting idea that hasn't been done before or since, as wipe immunity locations usually involve the whole team standing in a single location like War Priest, Oryx, or Nezarec. Giving each player their own immunity spot and punishing players who go to the same door at the same time is really interesting. I like how little time you have before the doors close because it rewards paying attention and not just mindlessly DPSing the boss. Overall, Kalli is a rather simple boss fight that's kind of mid, but not bad. It's just not a standout encounter for me. Shuro Chi, on the other hand, is one of my favorite encounters in Destiny history, and that's not just because of the banger soundtrack. Shuro Chi is an incredibly musical encounter, a race against the clock as you try to defeat her before she finishes her song and brings about your death. There are 6 short burst DPS phases interrupted by add clear and mechanics. The main mechanic to start damage is to have 3 players grab the crystals and step on the plates near the boss. They must fire their lasers to form a triangle around Shuro in order to stun her, starting a short damage phase. After DPS, players must clear adds in order to get Shuro Chi to progress to the next damage location where the stun mechanic repeats. There are 3 floors to the Shuro Chi arena, 2 DPS phases per floor. After the first and second floors, players must complete a puzzle where they stand on plates to fill in blank tiles on the screen of the arena. Once the correct plates are activated simultaneously, the puzzle is complete and will move on to the next of 3 screens. Players must rotate to the next wall, which will determine the orientation of the next puzzle. No player can stand on the same plate twice, and all of the plates in this encounter constantly damage players while they stand on them, meaning you need to coordinate when you jump on a plate to avoid deaths. Once 3 of these puzzles have been completed, you can proceed upwards to the next floor. I love this mechanic because it makes me feel like I'm dancing to Shuro Chi's song, coordinating my moves with each of my teammates, making sure we never end up out of sync. The entire encounter personifies the idea of dancing to a dangerous song, desperately trying to be quick and accurate so that Shuro Chi can't sing you to death. It's brilliant and incredibly fun due to the fast pace. The third boss of this raid is Morgeth, who introduces the Taken Strength mechanic. Taken Strengths are a power-up that give a buff of the same name when players jump into them. Players can only have 2 Taken Strengths at a time and will die if they try to pick up a third. Morgeth occasionally traps a player with 2 strengths in a tornado, requiring someone with an Eye of Riven to cleanse them using the grenade button. The Taken Strengths will then be transferred to the player who used the eye, allowing the other player to pick up 2 more without dying. Once a total of 10 strengths are held by players, damage begins where you can attack Morgeth. If you're too slow to gather all 10 strengths, you will wipe, much like Shuro Chi. Similar to Kalli, Morgeth is a somewhat mid-encounter but has some interesting ideas. It probably doesn't help that with 5 years of power creep, they've become the biggest pushover of a raid boss in the entire franchise, an incredibly easy one phase, more so even than Kalli, which is already very easy. I like the ideas of the encounter, but I think it's a bit too short and simple. I wish there was more expansion on the Taken Strength concept. When picking up the Eye of Riven in the Vault encounter, players must cleanse each vault plate rather than other players. They will also gain one of two buffs, Penumbra or Antumbra, which determine the plate they must cleanse to align the stars and unlock the vault. Vault seems much more complicated than it actually is because of the terms Penumbra and Antumbra, which are concepts from astronomy that describe regions in which you view different types of eclipses. Penumbra is a location from Earth where you can observe a partial eclipse, and the Antumbra is where you would see an annular eclipse. An annular eclipse is a conjunction of two heavenly bodies, where the apparent sizes of the two are slightly different, creating a halo effect surrounding the closer object. This is most famous when the moon eclipses the sun, creating a halo of light around a dark orb. These two terms are opposed to the umbra, which is the region in which you would see a total eclipse because the closer object has a larger apparent size than the farther object. An eclipse cannot have both an umbra and an antumbra, but it always will have one of those two and a penumbra. The key to the vault is in the concept of eclipses, which are all about the intersection of two celestial bodies. When reading the plates, there are three common symbols, two of which will appear on each of the three sides. The way to determine whether a plate needs penumbra or antumbra is to call out the center symbol from one of the sides, and have the other player who also has that symbol tell you whether the symbol is on their left or their right. If it's on the left, the second plate needs a penumbra cleanse, and if it's on the right, the second plate needs an antumbra cleanse. If both symbols were in the center, it would be a total eclipse, so the plate would be the umbra. However, this doesn't happen in the vault. Instead, a symbol being on the left represents a partial eclipse, and the symbol being on the right represents an annular eclipse. Mechanically, vault is incredibly simple, but because it requires careful communication to dissect the intersection of each of the three symbols, it can be confusing for some people. The mechanic of getting locked out of the room and needing to rotate through the outer circle, the correct direction to get back in with your buff to the plates, is a cool idea continuing the theme of rotating and aligning heavenly bodies. I think the design of the encounter is cool and enjoyable to play. It's one of those encounters a lot of players don't want to learn because it seems really complicated at first, but once you understand how simple it actually is, Vault is quite beautiful. Mechanically, the Riven encounter is one of the most complex and intricate in the franchise's history. Unfortunately, most players haven't had a chance to experience it because of what has been called the Riven cheese. This isn't an ordinary example of a cheese where a large portion of players will still do the encounter legit because the cheese has a trade-off. It's difficult to find a team to do Riven legit because the cheese strategy is so incredibly easy that most players never actually learn how to do the encounter's mechanics legit. I still haven't personally had the opportunity to do this legit, despite trying to get people to do it with me on multiple occasions, but Riven legit is something I want to experience at some point. The Riven cheese has been confirmed to be a strategy Bungie deliberately wanted to make viable, so it likely never will be patched. Power creep has made the cheese so easy that there's no reason to do Riven legit except to practice your team's communication skills, flex on other people, or just have the experience in the first place. In the legit version, the team would split into two teams of 3 and enter 2 separate rooms where one team is fighting Riven and the other is fighting another set of enemies while relaying information to the Riven team. However, to cheese Riven, all you have to do is figure out which room Riven will enter by checking for her shadow in the first room. Which room Riven will enter? That's a tongue twister. If you see the shadow, you can stay in that room as Riven's gonna come out there, but if you don't see it, you hug a wall that gives you joining allies and allows you to teleport to the entrance of the encounter, which you can use to quickly run to the second room where all 6 players deal as much damage to Riven as possible. As long as you deal enough damage to Riven to get her to final stand in a single phase, and don't destroy any of her eyes, you can completely bypass pretty much all of the encounter's mechanics. I'm not gonna lie, it does make me a little sad when game devs put a ton of effort into designing the mechanics of an encounter, only for them to be subverted and avoided by most players, but I have accepted that most players will take the path of least resistance, especially when grinding a raid repeatedly for loot or playing with unfamiliar players. Even if Bungie patched the joining allies wall, cheesing Riven would still be very doable. You just would have a coin flip on whether or not you're in the correct room. I'm assuming it was never patched because it would just make the cheese strategy slightly more annoying rather than impossible. The design of the encounter fundamentally is supposed to allow players to try the one phase to bypass mechanics, which is a cool idea, but I don't think Bungie will design an encounter the same way ever again, considering how much they seem to dislike players melting bosses and other activities like strikes. After defeating Riven in her final stand, Bungie has one more trick up their sleeve. Players must run inside the mouth of the boss they just defeated and damage her heart, stopping it from the inside. Once the heart has been stopped, the raid doesn't end. Instead, players have a final encounter to complete. Narratively, it's extremely fitting that Riven is the only boss in a Destiny raid to have an encounter after their death. Riven's heart must be carried back into the vault where it can be neutralized by Shuro Chi and Kalli. Riven maintaining power after death is essential to the concept of the Dreaming City curse and the deep lore of the Ahamkara. Even after the Great Ahamkara Hunt, many characters have kept bones from the Wish Dragons, which still retain remnants of powerful wish magic. Some have even speculated that the Ahamkara may have become more powerful in death than they ever were alive. I love the concept of maintaining power after death because it makes Riven and the Ahamkara more dangerous than any other enemy. Historically, Guardians have solved almost every problem by killing their enemies, but an enemy having power from beyond the grave is terrifying because you have limited options to defeat someone once they're dead. Riven and Savathun's plan is the greatest Xanatos gambit of all time. If the Awoken didn't kill Riven, she would destroy them, but if they did kill her, it allows her to complete Savathun's wish and curse the Dreaming City anyways, which still allows her to win. I love stories where villains are able to scheme so effectively that it's impossible for the protagonist to win. It feels cathartic because it feels very realistic and relatable to be put in a situation where no matter what you choose to do, you face negative consequences. The mechanic of carrying Riven's heart to the vault in a race against the clock is executed super well. Depending on how good your fire team is, this can either be extremely easy or a long drawn-out process with multiple wipes. The mechanics are relatively simple but require constant communication to ensure you don't wipe, so I think they're designed incredibly well. The random assignment of fates chosen once each player has been teleported is a cool mechanic that inserts a bit of chaos into the encounter. Everyone needs to know how to perform the two possible roles, otherwise you'll wipe when the wrong person is chosen. Like I've said many times before, my favorite encounters are ones where you don't need to plan who's gonna do what ahead of time and have to make quick decisions in the moment, forcing everyone to know how every mechanic works. Queenswalk is a fun encounter that I enjoy quite a bit, capping off an already fantastic raid. There will never be another raid like Last Wish. Depending on the day, Last Wish alternates with Vow of the Disciple as my favorite raid in Destiny history. There's just so much to love about Last Wish, and it's clear numerous Bungie developers poured a ton of love into the experience. It feels very special, so I'm almost always down to do a run of Last Wish. Very few raids have come close to how amazing Last Wish was, which is a shame. I wish every raid would receive the level of narrative, scale, and gameplay on offer in Last Wish. However, the raid is rather unique in many regards, not easily replicated, which is why it feels so special. I hope that Bungie will be able to replicate that lightning in a bottle for the Witness raid in the final shape, because they're the most powerful foe we will have ever faced. They deserve a raid that matches the high bar set by Last Wish. However, with recent revelations about behind-the-scenes turmoil in the Final Shape's development at Bungie, I'm a bit skeptical that's gonna happen. I'd love to be proven wrong though. Most of this video was written before the layoffs at Bungie were first reported, but I feel like they reinforce many of my arguments in this video. My heart goes out to everyone at Bungie who lost their jobs, but also the employees who remain and now have to try their best to win the trust of players back yet again, just like they did with Forsaken. In conclusion, there will never be another raid like Last Wish. What do you think about Last Wish? Do you like it as much as I do, or do you think it's overrated? And most importantly, do you think Bungie will ever release another raid like Last Wish? I'm eforme, and I would like to thank you for watching.